Hi, I'm Thanks Too Much, and today we're going to be taking a look at Far Cry 4 and exploring its themes of identity and civil war. As a little caution, I will be spoiling most of the story in Far Cry 4, so if you haven't played it yet, I definitely recommend you do so first before watching this video. But with that said, let's get into it. The Far Cry series needs no introduction to anyone who loves first-person shooters. Far Cry's combination of huge open-world environments, charismatic villains, and intriguing stories have made this series a juggernaut in the first-person shooter genre, even when it stumbles in some of its plot threads. While I understand that Far Cry 3 is considered to be the game that solidified the Far Cry formula for the next games to come, to me, Far Cry 4 had a deeper impact mainly because of its themes of identity and civil war. But there are a few things I want to say about Far Cry 3 to give my overall opinion on its narrative. While I agreed that the gameplay and mechanical features were highly influential to what the Far Cry franchise would become, I also believe that the narrative in that game was 50-50 in terms of the effectiveness of the points it was trying to make. In Far Cry 3's story, you play as young, rich, good-looking white dude called Jason Brody, who finds himself trapped in a pirate-infested island along with Vaz, one of the most recognized villains in the franchise and possibly in all of gaming. To start out with the positive, the narrative bits that work well in Far Cry 3 are the ones that criticize Jason, and by extension the player, about how someone can be desensitized to the violence that is happening around them, even if justified. If you become numb to the extreme violence around you, then aren't you becoming a monster? Or worse? This inner monologue and criticism works because it's pretty straightforward. Not everything needs to be subtle to be deep. Violence makes monsters of us all, and if you don't have somebody to reel you in, such as friends and family, then you are in danger of losing your humanity. However, the plot threads that don't work are basically everything else. Apparently, the writer for Far Cry 3, Jeffrey Yolam, wanted to subvert gaming and narrative tropes by making them even more exaggerated than they already are, with Citra as the uber-sexualized foreign native woman being one of those tropes that's so exaggerated it's supposed to be subversive. Problem is, when the narrative is dealing with serious inner monologues, such as how someone like Jason goes from privileged California rich kid to grizzled killer, trying to be sly and exaggerate on a story that many people are going to take serious because of its subject matter can be a near impossible task. Now, that's not to say that it hasn't been done before, and the newer Wolfenstein games are a good example of taking both serious and exaggerated themes and making them work together perfectly, with the exception of Youngblood. But you walk a razor-sharp knife's edge when trying to take two very different, contrasting themes and try to make them work in the same story. Unfortunately, Far Cry 3 stumbles in any story bit that doesn't involve critiquing the violence that Jason commits because the writer is trying to subvert a narrative that doesn't offer anything more than what's in front of you. You can't say Citra is a commentary on how bad the sexualized native trope is by making her a sexualized native trope and thinking that somehow counts as subversion. Exaggeration can only take you so far, and because the story tried a little too much, a little too hard in Far Cry 3, Far Cry 4 took a more direct and straightforward approach in its narrative, and it's better for it. Now, when people criticize Far Cry 4 for not being that much different than Far Cry 3, they are right in one aspect, and that's gameplay. Mechanically speaking, not much has changed. There are a few new activities here and there, and what worked in Far Cry 3 is more or less improved or given a narrative reason as to why something similar has to happen from Far Cry 3, but overall, the gameplay mechanics are fairly similar to the previous game. What is very different is the story and setting, and here we see Ubisoft make a conscious effort to get back to the basics of storytelling while still making their story deal with heavy themes such as identity and civil war. Enter our protagonist, Ajay Ghale. After the death of his mother, Ajay returns to the fictional country of Karat that would be located somewhere above India or Nepal, very close to the Himalayas. Ajay was born in Karat, but left with his mother to the United States when he was very young, so his own birth country is as foreign to him as it is to the player. This was a creative decision that made the game for me because even though Ajay is American, him still being from Karat makes the player feel that they have a bigger stake in what is going on without feeling like they are intruding in a culture that they would not belong to otherwise. Because Ajay has lived in the US all his life, he tries to explore and ask questions about the people and country he was born in but doesn't really understand. Many reviewers have pointed out that they felt Ajay was lacking as a character because he didn't say much besides asking the obvious or stating the obvious. But to me, this felt like Ajay was being cautious because he is trying to learn from his native country at the worst possible time. Kirat has been involved in a civil war for decades thanks to Kirat's dictator, Pagan Min, who serves as the game's main antagonist. It's a big reason why his mother decided to flee with him to the US. But when Ajay arrives to Karat, his own home culture is alien to him. So he starts learning from two people, Amita and Sabal, the two main leaders of the Golden Path, which is the resistance group warring against Pagan Min's royalist government. The problem here is that Amita and Sabal have two very different views of how they want Karat to be once the war is over. Sabal is a traditionalist and represents a more conservative view. Sabal wants to protect the old traditions and make Karat its own unique country. This in and of itself is a noble goal, but that also means keeping the traditions that follow Kirati religious beliefs to a T and keeping women as second-class citizens. Amita wants change and represents a more progressive view. She wants Kirat to let go of the old and harmful traditions and instead focus on modernizing, not just the country, but the culture. The modernization, however, means that Amita wants to do away with a big chunk of Kirati traditions, many of which are still extremely important to many Kiratis. She also wants Karat to gain influence in the world stage by selling heroin poppies, because she points out, and correctly I might add, that Pagan Min has stripped Karat of all its material value and wealth. It's in this tough split that Ajay finds himself when he returns to Karat, and both viewpoints have their basis in right and wrong. But the game cleverly avoids a right or wrong approach and instead forces the player to search for options that won't make everyone happy. However, this forces exploration of identity. As you talk to Amita and Sabal, you hear out their viewpoints and try to understand where each one is coming from and, sometimes, even reconcile their contradictions as a means to a greater good. Ajay might be an outsider, but he is in the perfect position to learn about what being a Kirati means to him. Even though you have to side with either Amita or Sabal eventually, that doesn't mean the player won't choose lessons from each of these characters and leave out the ones they don't agree with. Ajay's journey of trying to do right by as many people as possible while still knowing you will piss people off because of culture and traditional differences is a story that, in real life, many firstborn US kids from immigrant parents like myself can relate to. The US is a country of immigrants. That is our culture, and when I travel, many of my international friends tell me they see the US as a country of immigrants, unless of course you're Native American. But because of this, many first-generation US-born kids have a lot of leeway as to what values and traditions we want to keep from our countries of origin and which ones are better off left behind, to the chagrin of most of our parents. The American values of freedom of expression and the pursuit of happiness embolden people to search for who they want to be in a different way than our parents did. I can only speak for myself, but being a mix of Central American descent meant that I lived most of my childhood being sheltered by the realities of why my parents immigrated to the US, which, just like Far Cry 4, was due to civil war in many Central American countries in the 80s and 90s, thanks to the proxy war between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Even though I was born in Chicago, as I grew older, I started to understand and care about my roots and where I came from. I learned much about what traditions I wanted to keep and which ones I wanted to let go. Values like hard work, reliability, respect, humility were taught to me in Central America in ways that the US would never be able to teach me because of the difference in culture. However, things like machismo and certain religious followings were other traditions I decided to leave behind due to them being antiquated. The values of machismo and religious followings were no better in the US, mind you, but they just have a different name for them. But when I speak of my roots and origins, these things specifically, I can do without. Of course, that made my parents and other family members a little mad, but that's the kind of point that's also being made in Far Cry 4. Now, in real life, searching for your own identity through culture, tradition, and roots might not be as intense as fighting through a civil war like in Far Cry 4, but the themes are still the same. The search for who you are and who you want to be is not an easy one, especially for first generation Americans. Many people who talk about assimilating to American culture don't realize that you can do that while still keeping the roots that make you who you are unique. Finding that balance can be hard, and sacrifices, whether big or small, need to be made to keep that balance. Far Cry 4 asks you, what are you willing to sacrifice for Ajay to find his identity? What will Ajay sacrifice to become a karate while still being an American? Will Ajay save karate traditions at the expense of keeping outdated and harmful beliefs? Or will Ajay sacrifice what the karate people believe in for the sake of modernization? It's a perfect over-dramatization of real-life choices that conflict with where you might come from. Do I stay with a certain church for the sake of family comfort, or do I branch out on my own path, while still keeping some of the old-school beliefs to guide me? Again, not as hardcore as the choices you make in Far Cry 4, but still hard ones nonetheless. But Amida and Sabal are not the only sources of information from which Ajay can learn about his birth country of Karat. There are more silent and passive moments of exploration and learning thanks to the many unexplored areas of the map. Many of these areas have statues, monuments, and artifacts that teach Ajay about the history of his culture and where he can hopefully learn a lesson or two to better his own perspective without the pressure of having to choose sides. This is very similar to real life, even if the actual monuments and artifacts aren't as condensed in one place as they are in Far Cry 4. People like myself who are now adults and have the means to travel go back to where our parents were born and try to understand where we came from through more passive learning. Far Cry 4 even has a minigame called The Journey of Kalanog, which tells the tale of a mystical warrior, Kalanog, and his journey through Shangri-La. The journey is filled with fantastical elements and wondrous vistas, but the tale is one that karates find life lessons from, should they decide to look deeper into the story. In real life, there are no mythical adventures for any of us, but there are still stories from the people who still live where we came from. Many of the stories I have been told involve struggles and triumphs, embarrassments and accomplishments, sorrows and joys, and they all come from very human places. Especially now, these stories are important because they humanize the people telling them and create sympathy for any moment of hardship. These stories come from people much older and wiser than us, and in my case, help me gain an insight on my own life and maybe not to complain too much about the life I have in the US. The Journey of Kalanog might not be as deep as real life stories, but it still tries to teach Ajay something. It tries to teach him to fight for something bigger than himself while at the same time not lose sight of who he is as an individual. Real life works kind of the same way. And it's up to every person how they take the stories that are told to them through other people much older and wiser and modify them into something that makes them feel that they are learning for something bigger than themselves while still improving their own identity. And then, of course, we have the theme of civil war. In Far Cry 4, the Civil War is presented fairly straightforward. Pagan Min acts as Karat's merciless dictator, and the people have no choice but to rise up in resistance or be ruled by a brutal king. What is more fascinating to me is the backstory of events years before Ajay is even born. Throughout the game, you can find journal pages from Mohan Ghale. Mohan was Ajay's father, and one of the former leaders of the Golden Path, who was killed under mysterious circumstances. Mohan used to be a royal guard for the original royal family of Karat before there was an uprising. Mohan failed to protect them, and his royalist comrades were about to be defeated until Pagan Min came out of nowhere and offered his assistance to return the original royal family to the throne. Of course, this is Pagan Min we're talking about here. So as soon as he crushes any opposition and reinstates the royal family, he kills them and takes the power for himself. This was a huge disappointment for Mohan, and needless to say, he would not let this stand. So he and Ajay's mother, Ishwari, eventually created the resistance group that would be called the Golden Path. Mohan's journals are a many years journey of hope and disappointment that is not at all too different from real life Civil War conflicts. Without getting too personal, part of my family comes from the small Central American country of El Salvador. And during the 70s and 80s, the country was consumed in a brutal civil war between the government, which was backed by the US, and the guerrillas, which were backed by the Soviet Union through Cuba. There is a character named Willis Huntley who is a not so subtle jab at US interventionism with foreign countries, especially during the Cold War era. Willis Huntley is a CIA agent, and while he first appeared in Far Cry 3, he was more or less someone used just to keep the story going. He was shady but ultimately helpful. However, in Far Cry 4, it's more than obvious that Willis Huntley is on a mission of sabotage on behalf of the US. What that sabotage is, you don't really know until you complete his missions, and he forces Ajay to help him by revealing pages of Mohan's journal the more he helps him. Even though it's more than obvious that completing missions for Willis Huntley is a bad idea, it makes sense personally for Ajay because the journal entries help him understand how his father was involved in the Karate Civil War since its inception. It's not until Ajay's usefulness is spent that Willis Huntley reveals his mission was to eliminate all traces of the US involvement with the Karate Civil War, and he betrays Ajay by giving him to Pagan Min. Now, the betrayal isn't really that surprising. It's the revelation of the US trying to wipe out its involvement in foreign affairs that really rings true in the real world. From Vietnam to Central and South America, almost nothing positive has come from the US intervening in other countries' affairs and civil wars, especially at the height of the Cold War. But the cruel common denominator that all civil wars have is that in the middle are the country's normal folk who want nothing to do with the conflict but are forced into one side or another due to threats of death from both sides. It's a tragic situation that Far Cry 4 also has a representation in the character of Noir. Throughout the game, you have to deal with 3 of Pagan Min's lieutenants before you can take him head on. Noir is one of those lieutenants. The other 2 lieutenants are your typical bad guys. However, Noir is a tragic figure because she was at one point a brave person trying to do the right thing. Noir was actually a human rights activist and highly critical of Pagan Min's regime. Pagan Min responded to this criticism by kidnapping her family and forcing her to lead death games for the entertainment of the karate people as a cruel form of ironic punishment. Noir complies to save her family, but it is all for naught because her family is killed anyway, and when she finds out, she can't live with what she has done and lets herself be eaten by the animals in her own death games. This cruelty is accelerated and exaggerated for the sake of storytelling, but the theme still resonates in real life. When the Civil War in El Salvador finally ended in 1992, the people weren't naive enough to think that everything would go back to normal immediately, but there was hope that at least things would slowly recover, especially with leaders that saw the carnage caused by the Civil War and would not be so cruel as to take advantage of a people's hope for a better tomorrow. Unfortunately, no such luck for El Salvador. Regardless of whether the quote-unquote new political leaders fought for the government or for the guerrillas during the Civil War, they all did the same damn thing and stole from the people that bestowed trust upon them after such a bloody war. This kind of disappointment is even more crushing than what Mohan or Noir go through when Pagan Min forcefully takes power, because the real-life people of El Salvador have gone through years of recovering from a civil war that pit neighbor against neighbor and put leaders in control who they thought would be sympathetic to the hardships many of them had to go through. Instead, all that was given were broken promises, and it's not until just recently with the youth in El Salvador, many whom did not have to suffer through the Civil War, that new ideas have finally been presented because of a change in generation and perspective. When you finish the main story in Far Cry 4, that's exactly where Ajay finds himself, as a new leader with new ideas, whether he likes it or not. If you decide to spare Pagan Min, he will tell you how you can rule Kyrat with him gone. He even makes a sly statement that since you already quote unquote took care of one of the Golden Path leaders by this point, all you have to do is take care of the other, which does turn out to be a prophetic statement. As you play through the game, the arguments between Amida and Sabal become more and more heated, to the point that they can no longer be reconciled, and one of them needs to be taken out of the picture, one way or another. It all culminates with a religious ceremony that will turn a little girl called Badra into the Tarun Matara, a godlike figure in Karaite religious culture. Badra is, for all intents and purposes, the voice of the people in Karat. She doesn't appear much in the game, but when she does, it's to remind the player that regardless of what side you choose, you will affect the lives of the Karaite people. Badra just wants Karat to be free, but that freedom looks very different to the people doing the fighting. And regardless of whose side you end up choosing, like in real life, you are hit with the cruel realities of your so-called post-war allies. After you are done dealing with pagan men, Amida or Sabal will show their true colors and motives for wanting to control Karat. Amida preached on modernization, but after pagan men is dealt with, you find her rounding up young children to fight for her army, even as their parents beg her not to take them. It's even highly hinted that she has Badra killed so she can eliminate all traces of Karaite religious culture. Sabal preached traditionalism, but once the war is over, he rounds up all the Golden Path members who were loyal to Amida and executes them, their blood washing away their sins, as he puts it anyway. Many players were not happy about these post-credit endings, and in some way I can see this discontent because it takes away the power fantasy that the game had been feeding the player for 30 plus hours. However, I do have the utmost respect for Far Cry 4 ending its game in such an honest fashion. This is how civil wars end in real life, with disappointment and disillusionment. The only difference is that this disappointment is not so in your face like at the end of Far Cry 4, and it comes years and even decades after the conflict ends because now whoever is left in power wants to pick up the spoils. There have been arguments made that these endings prove that Pagan Min was right all along. Those who argue this point of view take an Easter egg ending, where if you actually wait for Pagan Min at the start of the game, he will take you directly to the game's ending, as proof that Pagan Min was actually the good guy. But let's not forget that Pagan Min's lust for power is the reason Karat is engulfed in civil war in the first place. Not to mention that as you play throughout the game, you save many Karaite citizens from being enslaved, beaten, tortured, and even sex trafficked by Pagan Min's royal guard. The last piece of commentary Far Cry 4 gives is that to end civil war, truly end it, those who fight it either need to stand down or die off with time. People with new perspectives who also respect where they come from are your best bet for actual change in post-Civil War years, whether for better or worse. At the end of Far Cry 4, Ajay stands alone. After realizing the true colors of Amida and Sabal, there's just no fucking way they can be trusted anymore, and most players will be compelled to kill them for the safety of Karat. The future of Karat is now in Ajay's hands. Ajay did fight in the Karaite Civil War, but he also came from a place that did not tether him to any vision of Karat once the war is over. Ajay's experiences of seeing people suffer throughout Far Cry 4 should, hopefully, make him realize that the extremes in traditionalism, modernization, and authoritarianism will only lead to more suffering and death. This is not to say an American knows better. After all, Ajay was born in Karat. But it is saying that those who fought the Civil War longer than Ajay has will have a skewed and most likely dangerous view of what is best for their people after such a deadly conflict due to what they have been through. Ajay did fight in the Karaite Civil War, but he hasn't been scarred by it yet. The game subverts the traditional game ending of being king of the hill because even though Ajay is the only obvious leader left for Karat, he now has to take charge of a country that is still in ruin with a long recovery period ahead. Truly, an unenviable position. What kind of leader will Ajay be? Ruthless like Pagan Min? Modern like Amida, minus the power hungriness? Traditionalist like Sabal, minus the execution of people? Or will he take his experiences of the war to be his own leader? This is left for the player to imagine since the game ends once Amita, Sabal, and Pagan Min are dealt with, and the DLC that's available for Far Cry 4 is more of a wacky what-if scenario and not canon to the main game. Still, with all these heavy themes, I respect Far Cry 4 for presenting something I never thought I would see in a game. It's definitely a fun, kick-ass open-world game, for sure, but there is definitely something below the surface for someone like me to sink my teeth into. Thank you for watching.
I need your help! My wife was eaten by rabid honey badgers! What is wrong with you? Why are you laughing?
Oh, shit. You're serious? I am so sorry. That's terrible. How can I help?